In this video and the next video, we're going to be exploring answers to the question that is posed at the bottom of the introductory screen here. Is lying worse than misleading? So we've talked a fair amount in this course already about what lying is, what misleading is, and how they are similar and how they are different from one another. But there's this other question that philosophers are interested in, which is one worse than the other? And that is worse morally than the other. So there's a standard view out there amongst philosophers, which is that lying is worse than misleading. And in this video, we're going to discuss three different reasons that philosophers have given for thinking that you are making a greater moral mistake when you lie to someone than if you were to mislead that person. And then in the next video, we're going to take a look at Jennifer Saul's pretty recent essay where she argues that that's just not true. She thinks that lying is not necessarily worse than misleading, and that the two are pretty much on par with one another with respect to how bad they are morally. So what I want to do in this video is I want to sort of frame our conversation about the reasons that philosophers generally give for thinking that lying is worse than misleading. I want to kind of frame it around one of the examples that we've already discussed, hoping that it's sort of still familiar to you. So remember the Tony case? So remember in this case, Lisa and Tony are married to one another, and Tony is having an affair at work with a woman named Nina. So he's cheating on his wife with a woman named Nina. So Lisa gets suspicious about this. And so when he comes home from work on a given day, she asks him this question: did you have lunch with Nina today? And then when he responds to her in the example that we've discussed, right, he doesn't lie to her, right? Lying to her would be to just say, no, I didn't have lunch with Nina today. And instead, he misleads her. He says, I had lunch in my office today. And so the reason why that's misleading rather than lying is because he did have lunch in his office that day. Remember, in this example, he eats lunch in his office with Nina, right? So when he says, I had lunch in my office today, he's telling the truth. I mean, he's saying something that he believes is true. It's truthful, and so that's why he's not lying. But what he says here clearly implicates, right, that he had lunch in his office by himself. So he's misleading Lisa by getting her to think that he had lunch by himself in his office. And so that's why it's misleading. But he's not actually lying to her, right? Because he doesn't just come out and say, no, I didn't have lunch with Nina today. So let's use this case then to compare misleading and lying with respect to which one's morally worse, by then just adding to this equation the other possibility. All right, so in the case that we've discussed it, as we've discussed it so far, Tony misleads his wife by saying, I had lunch in my office today. But let's just get the other possibility out on the table here. So instead of misleading her, he could have just lied to her. And if he would have just lied to her when she asked, did you have lunch with Nina today? He would have again have just said something like, no, I didn't have lunch with her. So this is just an outright lie. And again, it's because when he asserts this, he's asserting something that's untruthful because he knows full well that he did have lunch with her. So if he were to assert that he didn't have lunch with her, he'd be saying something untruthful, and therefore he would be lying to her. So the question for our purposes then here in this video is, why might somebody think that it would be worse for him to lie than to mislead? Let me clarify one more thing here before we look at these three reasons. When philosophers say that lying is worse than misleading in this scenario, they're not taking away from the fact that it's bad for Tony to mislead his wife in this case. That is, everyone agrees that he shouldn't be deceiving his wife about this. I mean, everyone agrees that it's bad for him to mislead her and it's bad for him to lie to her, right? He's making a moral mistake by deceiving her, regardless of which of these two ways he decides to deceive her. When philosophers say that lying is worse, so they're not saying that misleading isn't a bad thing. They're saying they're both bad things, but that lying is a worse bad thing, right? So what they'd be saying is that misleading here would be the better of two bad options, right? Okay, so first reason. This reason is often attributed to Immanuel Kant, and Adler, in his essay, discusses this. So Adler doesn't agree with this reason, but the explanation of it he gives, I think, is pretty clear. So if you go and you look at Adler in the Adler essay, he explains this reason again that is often attributed to Kant. So it goes something like this. When Tony lies to Lisa, if he lies to Lisa by saying, no, I didn't have lunch with Nina, then, so this argument goes, that Lisa actually has less responsibility for the success of that deception than she does if Tony deceives her by misleading her by saying, I had lunch in my office today. So this reason starts by sort of noting that if we think about this from the perspective of how responsible Lisa is when this deception happens, the idea behind this first reason is that she just has more responsibility, right, for Tony's deception working when he misleads her versus when he lies to her. So let's unpack that a little bit. When he lies to her, her only role in the deception here is to simply believe what he says, right? So when he says to her, no, I didn't have lunch with Nina today, the success of his deception only requires her to do one thing, and that is just believe him, right? So if he says, I didn't have lunch with her, she believes him when he says that he didn't have lunch with her, boom, the lie is successful, right? The deception works. So her role is limited in that all she needs to do for that deception to actually occur or work is to just believe what he says. But notice over in the misleading case, she has to do more than just believe Tony when he makes his assertion in order for Tony's deception to work in the case of misleading. When he responds to her question by saying, I had lunch at my office today, she has to do two things in order for his deception to work. First, she has to believe him, right? Just like in the case of lying. She has to believe that he had lunch in his office today. But second, she has to infer, right, when he says, I had lunch in my office today, that he wasn't eating lunch in his office with Nina. Otherwise, the deception isn't going to work, right? So in the case of misleading, Lisa has to believe him and to make the appropriate inference. Whereas in the case of lying, all she has to do is believe him. And so therefore, the argument goes, she has less responsibility in the case of lying and more in the case of misleading. If you're having trouble following that, the idea is kind of could be captured in this hypothetical exchange between Tony and Lisa, right? So if she asks, did you have lunch with Nina today? And he misleads her by saying, I had lunch in my office today. He tells her that. And then let's say later that day, he's talking to one of his friends about how he misled his wife when she asked him this question. And the friend says, Tony, what are you doing? You shouldn't be deceiving your wife in that way. Tony might say something like this. He might say, I didn't lie to her. I didn't say anything that I don't think is true. I just said I had lunch in my office today. And if she wants to infer from that I wasn't eating lunch with Nina, then that's her problem, right? So when Tony says that in response to his friend, he's kind of getting at this idea that Lisa has more responsibility. When he says that's her problem, if she wants to infer that I wasn't having lunch with Nina, what he's getting at is that he sees her as being more responsible for why she got deceived, right? Why is she deceived when he lies to her? Because he lied to her. Why is she deceived when he misleads her? Well, partly because he misled her, but also partly because she made the inference that allowed herself to be misled. That's the kind of idea here. Okay, so that's sort of step one. Here's step two. If we agree, and we may not, if we agree that when Tony lies to Lisa, Lisa has less responsibility for the success of the lie than the responsibility that she has if he tries to mislead her. He has more she has more responsibility when he misleads her for the success of the deception. Then what seems to follow from that is that if she has more responsibility for the success of the deception in the case of misleading, then Tony has less responsibility, right? And again, that's kind of what he's getting at when he's talking to his friend and he says, if she wants to make that inference, that's her problem. What he's sort of getting at there is he's less responsible for the deception in that case. It's more on her, right? Whereas over on the lying side, if Lisa's less responsible for the deception, that means Tony is more responsible for the deception, right? So the argument goes then, the reason lying is worse is because the reason why lying is worse than deception is because Tony, the liar, has more responsibility in the case of the lie than he does in the case of the misleading. Therefore, his act of lying is a worse thing. His act of lying is a worse thing because he's more responsible for the badness that results. He's more responsible for the deception that results. So since he's more responsible for that badness, it makes it worse for him to lie and not quite as bad for him to deceive, because on that side, he would be less responsible for the bad result, which is the deception. Okay, reason number two. This reason is defended by Chisholm and Feehan in their essay. And this reason is quite a bit different from the first. So the second reason for thinking that lying is worse, excuse me, appeals to what they call a breach of trust or a breach of faith. So it goes something like this. When you assert something, anything in any context, it doesn't have to be lying or misleading, just anytime you assert anything, Chisholm and Feehan say that your audience has a right to believe what you're saying. When you assert anything, you're inviting them, you're inviting their trust, you're inviting them to believe whatever it is that you're saying. And so if they do believe what you're saying, it's a perfectly reasonable thing for them to do, to believe your assertion. So another way of putting that would be, in this case, when Tony lies to Lisa and says, no, I didn't have lunch with her, if that lie is successful, then Lisa is going to trust that Tony believes what he is asserting. Right. So not only does Lisa have a right to believe that he didn't have lunch with her when he says it, she also has a right to believe that Tony believes that he didn't have lunch with her. Right. So when I assert something to you, it's reasonable for you to believe what I'm saying, and it's reasonable for you to believe that I believe what I'm saying, right? So same thing here. He says I didn't have lunch with her, so Lisa's going to trust, if she trusts him, right? She's going to trust that he didn't have lunch with her, and more importantly, she's going to trust that he believes that he didn't have lunch with her. Same thing over on the other side. This is just another case of asserting. When he misleads her, he asserts that I had lunch in my office today. So she's going to trust that he had lunch in his office that day, if she trusts him. And she's going to trust that he believes that he had lunch in his office that day. So she's going to trust that he believes what he's asserting. So it's the exact same thing on both sides, right? So why is the lying worse? The lying is worse because, and this should be relatively obvious, that trust is breached or broken in the case of the lie, but not in the case of misleading. So in the case of the lie, Lisa trusts that he believes that he didn't have lunch with her, right? Well, does he believe that he didn't have lunch with her? No, he believes he did have lunch with her, right? He had lunch with Nina in his office. So Tony does not believe what he is asserting here. So since Lisa trusts that he believes what he's asserting and he doesn't believe what he's asserting, that trust is broken. That trust is breached. Whereas in the case of misleading, that doesn't happen at all, right? Because here she trusts that he believes what he's asserting. Does he believe what he is asserting in this case? Yeah, he believes that he had lunch in his office today. He knows he had lunch in his office. He had it with Nina, but he knows he had lunch in his office. So he believes it. So that means this trust that Lisa has in him, that he believes what he's asserting, that trust is not breached. It's not broken in this case because he actually does believe it. So Chisholm and Feehan are arguing them in their essay that this is what makes the lying worse. Lying is worse because it involves this breach of trust, whereas misleading involves no such breach of trust. Okay, finally, the third reason, and this is Strudler's reason that he gives in his essay. So before we talk about his reason, let me just make something kind of clear here. Strudler thinks that the second reason that we just went over, Chisholm and Feehan's reason, Strudler thinks that that second reason isn't right. And we'll talk about this a lot more in the next video when we look at Saul's objections to the second reason. But Chisholm thinks that, or sorry, Strudler thinks that when Tony misleads Lisa, that there is a breach of trust there, just like there's a breach of trust when he lies to her. So Chisholm and Feehan are saying that lying involves this breach of trust, whereas misleading does not. Strudler and Saul both think that's just completely wrong. They think that misleading does involve a kind of breach or violation of trust, just like lying does. So Strudler is going to say, hey, they both involve this violation of trust. So why then is lying worse if both lying and misleading involve this breach of trust? Strudler's answer is trust is damaged more in the case of lying than it is in the case of misleading. So he's going to say trust is damaged in both cases, which I think should be relatively obvious if you think about this kind of case. And let's say he lies to her or he misleads her and she discovers it in both cases. I think trust is going to be damaged in both cases. But what Strudler is contending is there's more irreparable damage to the trust when he lies to her than when he misleads her, and that's why the lying is worse. Okay, so let me just sort of use what he says in the essay to kind of illustrate why he thinks that trust is damaged more in the case of a lie. Imagine what happens in the case of a lie where she finds out that he lied, right? So she asks, did you have lunch with Nina today? He lies to her and says, no, I didn't have lunch with her. And then she calls one of Tony's colleagues and asks, did you see Tony having lunch today? And the colleague says, yeah, he went into his office with some woman named Nina that he works with here, and they had lunch together in his office, right? So the lie is found out. She knows he lied to her. It's going to be very, very difficult for him to reestablish that trust because the trust was damaged so much by that lie. She might never believe him again, especially when it comes to things like this. So it's going to be very, very hard for him to regain her trust if he just outright lies to her in this way. Okay. Compare that to the case where he misleads her. So let's say he misleads her. He says, I had lunch in my office today. But he doesn't just come out and say, no, I didn't have lunch with her. He just says, no, I had lunch in my office today. But Lisa's real smart, right? She knows he's a misleader. She knows that he likes to palter in this kind of way. And she's learned that she has to be very, very careful with his words. So when he says, I had lunch at my office today, she kind of furrows her brow and says, okay, maybe you had lunch in your office today, but did you have lunch with Nina? So then when the chips are down and he is asked that question again directly, when she asks him, okay, you had lunch in your office today, but was Nina with you when you had lunch in your office today? And let's say he comes clean and just says yes. So notice what's happening here. She asks the general question, did you have lunch with Nina today? He misleads her, palters, by saying, I had lunch at my office. So when she presses him on that and says, okay, I believe you that you had lunch in your office. I believe you're telling the truth there. But what I really want to know is, was she with you in your office when you had lunch in your office? So what she's doing there is she's giving him the chance to lie, right? All he has to do to lie to her when she asks, was she with you when you had lunch in your office? If he just says, no, she wasn't with me, boom, he's lied to her, right? Then he's just back over on this side. But if what Tony does when she presses him on that point, when she asks, was Nina with you in your office when you had lunch? If he says, he shrugs his shoulders and he says, yeah, she was with me, and he admits to it. What Strudler thinks here is that much less trust is damaged in that case when he comes clean, meaning that she gave him the opportunity to lie to her and he would not do it. So at the end of the day, when he misleads her, Lisa's probably going to walk away thinking this: I got to be careful with this guy. He's sneaky. He likes to mislead me. He likes to tell me things that are true in order to be deceptive. But at least I know he's not going to lie to me, right? That's what she would be thinking, right? She gave him the chance to lie and he wouldn't take it. He's just going to be misleading her. So that means that there's a lot less trust damaged over there. Like, she knows that if she asks him a very, very clear and direct question, she's probably going to get the truth out of him. Whereas if she asks him something more vague that allows him to sort of mislead and palter, he's probably going to do that. So she now just knows that she has to think carefully, ask her questions clearly, and sort of think about what he's literally saying and what he's just implicating in order to make sure she doesn't get deceived. So what Strudler says then is that because there is more trust that's damaged on the lying side, meaning that it's harder for Tony to regain that trust, and there's less damage, less trust damaged on the misleading side, meaning that it's easier for him to sort of recover that trust. That is the reason why, according to Strudler, that lying is worse. Now, just very quickly before I finish up the video here, Strudler's explanation of this is a bit more complex than I'm making it out to be here. So he gives these sort of deeper explanations of why he thinks that more trust is damaged in the case of lying versus misleading. And if you want sort of an explanation of that, if you look in the notes that I posted that correspond to this video, in there, I sort of try to sort of unpack the sort of more detailed explanations that he gives for why he thinks that more trust is damaged in the case of the lie rather than when Tony misleads.